Well, hello everybody and welcome back. It's nice to have you here. In the previous clip, we created our very first Corona physical material, and then we sort of decked it out with the help of these awesome presets right here, right? Right. Now in this tutorial, we'll be creating a Corona physical material from scratch, meaning that we won't be using these presets here, and instead, we're just going to take this default Corona physical material and we're going to start tweaking it, okay? Now, the material that we'll be creating is going to be this sort of raw wood material that's going to get applied on our violence body here. Okay, so that's what we'll be doing here. And as you can already see, we have already created a Corona physical material. It's already sitting in our canvas, in our Corona node material editor here. And so, let's just get straight to it, shall we? Okay, so the very first parameter that we want you to pay attention to whenever you're creating a Corona physical material from scratch is located under the General tab, General menu, General category, whatever you want to call it, under this General menu here, okay? And it is this metalness mode parameter. Now, this parameter is extremely important because it will fundamentally affect how your material works under the hood and also how the UI inside this Corona physical material will work. Okay, now the metalness mode parameter is a drop-down menu, and if we expand it, you can see that we essentially need to choose between two options, a non-metal option and a metal option. Now, what these are referring to is the types of materials that you're creating. So essentially what you're deciding here is whether you're listening to non-metal or metal music genres. Just kidding, of course. What you're deciding here is whether you're creating a non-metal material or a metal material. All right, now, typical examples of non-metal materials would be, say, your different types of wood materials, your plastic materials, or, different types of concretes and so on and so forth, okay? If you're talking about metal materials, then, typical examples would be chrome, iron, stainless steel, and so on and so forth. Okay, and so you're probably getting a sense of why this parameter here is so important, because you're essentially deciding what kind of a material you'll be creating. Now, before we demo just how important this parameter actually is, let's just go under the base layer here and let's tone down the roughness. Okay, so we're going to set our roughness to be 0% here. And what that's going to do is it's going to make our reflections very mirror-like. It's going to make our reflections very glossy. Okay, but don't worry, we're going to talk about the roughness parameter more in depth just a little bit later on. For now, we're just lowering it so our reflections are less diffuse. Okay, so they're more glossy. Now, back to the metalness mode parameter. If we switch our mode here from non-metal to metal, observe what's going to happen in our interactive renderer and also in our material previews here, okay? So we're going to switch from non-metal to metal and check this out. Okay, so now our material looks like a basic, typical metal material would look like, both in the interactive renderer as well as in the material previews here. Okay, and so, just by changing this one single parameter here, our material looks drastically different. And so hopefully now you're starting to get a sense of just how important this parameter is. So if we switch back to non-metal, well, check this out, right? There's a lot more of that diffuse component to our material, a lot more of that white color, and the reflections don't seem quite as strong as they were before, right? Right, so those are sort of the under the hood changes that you're changing or defining when you're selecting the metalness mode here. But we also mentioned that there are some pretty important UI changes that will happen when you switch between these two modes. Okay, so if we go under the base layer here, and don't forget, currently our mode is set to non-metal. If we go under the base layer here, you can see that, for example, we have access to the Ior parameter. Okay, so we can tweak it to our heart's content, right? Right. Okay, one of the parameters here that we actually don't have access to is the edge color parameter, or the edge color grouping, to be more precise, right? As you can see, it's totally grayed out. Now, if we go under the basic menu here, you're going to see that currently we can make this material be refractive. Okay, and we can make it do volumetrics. or we can also make it do subsurface scattering, right? So we have all of these different options here available to us right now. Well, with the exception of this edge color grouping / parameter here. Okay, but now observe what's going to happen if we switch our metalness mode from non-metal to metal. Okay, check this out. Under the base layer, the Ior parameter is now grayed out. But the edge color parameter, well, look at that. All of a sudden, we can tweak it, right? And then if we go under the basic menu here, well, you're going to see here that we can't make this material refractive anymore. I can click on the refraction checkbox here all day long. Nothing's going to happen. We can't make it do volumetrics either, and we can't make it do subsurface scattering either. Okay, but now some of you are probably wondering, well, hey, what the heck is going on? Why is this happening? Well, to better demo what's happening, let's bring in a Corona legacy material here. Let's drag it on into our Corona node material editor here onto its canvas. And let's turn it into this typical metal-like material. Okay, so we're going to disable the diffuse component, then we're going to tune up the Fresnel IOR to a value of 10. Okay, so we get this metal-looking material. All right, now what we can do is, with the legacy material, is we can, for example, enable a refraction. All right, so think about this for a second. We've created a refractive metal material. And these types of materials don't exist in the real world. They're not physically plausible. Okay, sort of jokingly, internally, we call these types of materials material monstrosities because they just don't exist in the real world. Okay, but as you're able to see, right, with the legacy material, you could have easily created this non-physical material, right? Now let's delete the legacy material, and hopefully now you're starting to get an idea of how the physical material UI here is sort of changing whenever you're tweaking this metalness mode parameter, right? So metals can't do refractions in the real world. So this is a physical material. You can't make this metal material be refractive, right? You can't make it do volumetrics, and you can't make it do subsurface scattering because, guess what? Metals don't exhibit these kinds of properties in the real world. Okay. Now, if we switch our metalness mode here from metal to non-metal, well, non-metal materials do exhibit these kind of properties. Non-metal materials can be refractive. Non-metal materials can do subsurface scattering, and non-metal materials, can do volumetrics. Okay. And so that's how the Corona physical materials UI is kind of sort of adapting to the type of material that you're creating here. And so it will sort of guide you towards creating that proper, physically plausible non-metal material, or, that proper, physically plausible metal material. Now, in this tutorial, we're creating a raw wood material, right? And that is, by definition, a non-metal material. So we won't focus on, on creating a material where the mode would be set to metal just yet. We're going to do that in one of the upcoming clips, and we're also going to explain why the Ior parameter is grayed out for metal materials, and so on and so forth. But again, this tutorial is about creating that raw wood material. So, that's what we're going to focus on here first. So, raw wood material is a non-metal material, and so we're setting the mode here to be non-metal. Okay, so that's the first step that we needed to take here, the first parameter that we needed to tweak. And now, we can go under the base layer here, and we can start tweaking things. Okay, and typically what you do first is you start bringing in some sort of a texture, right, to define that basic quality of a surface. And because we're creating a raw wood material here, we need some sort of a raw wood diffuse texture. All right, and coincidentally, or not, we already have one prepared here. So let's just scoot it over here, okay? And let's plug this texture, this shader, right into the texture slot in our base layer here, in our physical material. But actually, before we do that, let's just quickly explain what this Tri-Planar Map here is for. So basically, this violin body here is not properly UV unwrapped. Okay, and so if we plug this bitmap directly into the texture slot in our base layer here, you're going to see that we're getting these seams here. Okay, and probably in other places as well. But you know, the Tri-Planar shader, the Corona Tri-Planar shader is really good at sort of blending between those seams. So, you know, that's why we have it here. All right, so if we plug the Tri-Planar shader right into the texture slot of our physical material, so this is this slot right here, you know, well, now we've successfully plugged in our diffuse texture and we're getting that nice raw wood materials look happening, right? Right, and that pretty much takes care of that diffuse component right there. But, you know, as you can see, the reflections are not exactly how you would expect them to be for the raw wood material. You know, for a typical raw wood material that you would see in real life. So what we need to tweak is the reflections and how diffuse or how glossy they are, how rough or how glossy they are, to be more specific. Okay, and that's what this roughness parameter here does. Okay, so if we up the roughness value, the reflections are going to become rougher. They're going to become more diffuse, or if we put it, if we say the same thing with different words, the reflections are going to become less glossy. Okay. Now, the roughness parameter sort of by default replaces the glossiness parameter because the roughness parameter is an industry standard. All right. But in principle, how the roughness parameter works is it's basically, well, it is an inverted glossiness. Okay. So with glossiness, you know, if you had your glossiness set at 100%, your reflections would be super glossy, very mirror-like, right? But with the roughness parameter, it's the other way around. You know, with the roughness parameter at 100%, you're saying, hey, these reflections are super rough. Okay, and so then if you start lowering the value here, you know, you're saying the reflections are not rough at all. Okay, they're very mirror-like. And that's how this roughness parameter here works. And again, it's basically inverted glossiness. Okay, so with glossiness previously, you know, if we had the glossiness parameter here, you know, you could, if you set it to 100%, your reflections would be super glossy, super mirror-like. Okay, but with the roughness parameter, it's the other way around. And that's exactly how it is. Okay, roughness is inverted glossiness. But again, roughness is sort of the industry standard. That's why by default, you're going to be greeted by the roughness parameter here instead of glossiness, okay? But, you know, no shame if you still, if you still prefer the glossiness workflow, well, we got you covered. Okay, so you can go under the advanced tab here, the advanced menu, and in here, you're going to see that you have this roughness mode parameter. Okay, and if you expand it, you can see that you can choose between using the roughness mode or using the glossiness mode. And again, it comes down to what you prefer. None is better, none is worse. If you're working with a lot of glossiness maps, well then by all means, you know, set the roughness mode here to glossiness. All right, and once you do that, if you go under the base layer again, you're going to see that the roughness parameter changes to the glossiness parameter. And, you know, it behaves exactly as we've described before. You know, with the glossiness parameter, you're essentially saying, hey, how glossy are these reflections? And if they're 100% glossy, they're going to be 100% mirror-like. Okay? Whereas, again, with the roughness parameter, you were setting how rough they were. So if they're 100% rough, they're not going to be glossy. They're not going to look like they look now. They're going to look very diffuse. So basically, they're going to look completely opposite the way that they do now. Okay. Okay. Now, the way that we switched the roughness mode here was on a per material basis. All right. And that, if you really want to stick to the glossiness workflow, and again, that's perfectly fine. If you want to stick to it, you don't want to go into every physical material in here under the advanced menu and always have to, you don't always want to change the roughness mode here on a per material basis, right? And so if you want to edit the defaults, well, just go under the edit menu here, open up the preferences, and in here, you're going to see that you have this physical material defaults compartment. And in here, you have this roughness mode. And if you set it to be set to say glossiness, okay, well now every new physical material that you're going to bring in to your scene, all right, is going to be using the glossiness workflow. Okay, so again, if you really want to stick to the glossiness workflow, no worries, we got you covered. You can change it on a per material basis in here, or you can change the defaults under the preferences. Okay, but since roughness is the industry standard, we're just going to stick to roughness here. So let's set the roughness mode defaults here to roughness, and then also let's delete the material that we just created here, and then change the roughness mode in our raw wood material here from glossiness to roughness. Okay. So now with roughness, similarly as with glossiness maps, you typically want to plug in some sort of a map here. Okay, and again, we have a map prepared, so let's just scoot it over and let's plug it into the roughness slot here. Okay, once we do that, well, look at that. Our reflections are looking a bit more detailed than they were before when we simply defined them with a single value, because now we're using this roughness map here to essentially add some imperfections to the reflections as well. So some parts of the wood are now going to be rougher, some parts are going to be less rougher, and that's how those reflections are going to behave. So this is a pretty typical move here, right, to plug in a roughness/glossiness map into the roughness/glossiness slot. Now you could further tweak it, right? So you could still play with the values here and so on and so forth, but we aren't going to do that right here because we're already kind of happy with the results. Now, one thing that we should probably still mention is that the roughness/glossiness slider, depending on what you're using, okay, we're just going to keep saying roughness here. So the roughness slider here works a little bit differently than it did before with the legacy material. So if we now, for example, drop the value to 0%, you're going to see that we're getting super glossy reflections, even though we have a map plugged in here. And so for all of you who've used the legacy material throughout all these years, this is new behavior. And what is essentially happening here is that once you have your map plugged in to the roughness slot here, you're essentially having this value slider here act as a mix slider. So as you start upping the value slider here, trying to get more towards 100%, the more you're saying, hey, at 100%, we're 100% mixing this map into the roughness slot. Okay, so at 50%, we're essentially dealing with, a completely non-rough material, but, we're mixing 50% of this map on top of that zero roughness parameter, if you will. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense here. Now, for our material here that we're creating, this map is perfectly fine to be set at 100% because we're really happy with the results we're getting here. Okay. All right, cool. So with the roughness now sort of demystified, if you will, not that it needed a lot of demystifying, but hey, let's talk about the IOR parameter. And the IOR parameter works exactly the same way as it did with the legacy material. You just set it to a value where you want to set it, or you can plug in an IOR map in here. But additionally, with the new Corona physical material, what you can do is you can go under the advanced menu here again, and you're going to see that here you have this IOR mode drop down. And if you expand it, you can see that you can choose between using the IOR workflow or the Disney specular workflow. Okay, so if we switch to Disney specular here, go under the base layer again, you're going to see that now that IOR parameter is gone and it's been replaced by this specular parameter. Okay, so if you're using proper, and it's important to note, proper, so if you're using proper specular maps, you can switch the Corona physical material to be using the specular workflow. Okay, now again, if you go under the advanced tab here in your material settings, you're setting the IOR mode on a per material basis. All right, but if you go under the preferences again, you're going to see that under the physical material defaults compartment, you can also set the IOR mode to be working sort of on a global basis as a global default. Okay, so if we switch to Disney Specular here, if we bring in a new current physical material, then this new material is going to be using the specular workflow. Okay, so for all of you who like to use the Disney Specular workflow, who like to use proper specular maps, well, we've got you covered with the new physical material. But, IOR is working great for us here. So let's just switch back to the IOR workflow. So in our material, in our physical material here, IOR mode should be set to IOR because, we're perfectly happy with it here. But again, feel free to choose. Feel free to choose. All right. Okay. Next up, to sort of finish this basic material off here, we typically want to plug in a bump map in here as well. Okay. So typically, your basic material makeup will consist of sort of a diffuse texture, some sort of a roughness / glossiness texture, right? And then also some sort of a bump map so that you can add some of those imperfections, sort of bumps and bruises, if you will, so that your material isn't this perfectly smooth, totally ironed out surface, right? Okay, and as you've probably guessed, we already have a bump map prepared here. So let's just scoot it over, and then let's just plug it into the base layers bump slot here. Okay, that's all we needed to do. Well, I'm lying. You also need to enable the bump effect. Okay, so just hit this enable button here, and ta-da! Now we've added those bump imperfections to our material here. And as you can see, they're really coming through here. You can see these bumps and bruises, and quite honestly, they're a little bit too strong for the look that I want to go here. So I'm just going to play with the value here. I want to make it a lot stronger. I'm gonna set it to 200%, but obviously that's not what I want. So let's lower it to maybe 50%. And at this point, you're just being creative. You're looking at the render, and you're trying to make it look good, trying to make it look the way you want it to. So I just want there to be some imperfections. You see, just some bumps and bruises, and that's sort of what I want here. Okay, so a value of 35% works great for me here. And as far as the workflow goes, it's exactly the same as it was with the legacy material. Okay. Okay, so we kind of finished our basic raw wood material here. As you can see, it looks pretty convincing. It looks realistic. And of course, sure, you could still tweak it. You could add more shaders to it, right? You could add more bitmaps to it. You could add a lot more imperfections to it, readjust the bump effect, and so on and so forth. But, for what we're trying to go for here, I think this is looking pretty great. We've plugged in a diffuse texture to get that, that diffuse look going. Then we've sort of broken the reflections up a little bit, right? We added details to them essentially, right? So that some parts of this raw wood material are a bit more rougher, others are a bit more glossy, if you will, so not so rough. And then we've added some bumps and bruises to our material. And just by doing that, take a look at this. We've created this pretty cool, awesome, and realistic looking raw wood material here. And so that's it for this clip here. Okay, we've successfully done what we set out to do. And in the next clip, well, oh boy, we're going to be adding a clear coat layer on top of this raw wood material. And so we're going to turn this raw, untreated wood material into that nice sort of proper violin wood material that has those nice clear coat finishes applied on top of it. And as you'll see, that's going to be a very drastic change from the material that we've created here, just because we'll be focusing on that clear coat layer. So thank you for tuning into this one, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye, everybody.